Hi everyone. While I'm waiting for the sealant to cure, it's a good opportunity to tidy up my subframe. I've already removed most of the rust with a wire wheel and now I'm giving it a coat of rust converter to prevent it from rusting any further. When the rust converter is dry, I'll add a coat of primer. This time I'm using zinc spray. In my experience, spray paint is not enough to keep rust away, even under wax oil. That's why I always like to paint the surface with a paint gun or brush. This time I'll be using hammerite and brush. Once the paint was dry, I gave the subframe a good coat of wax oil and I'm pretty happy how it turned out. My upper engine mount has seen better days. The sad thing is that you can't really find a new one, at least not easily. But luckily there's this blog post saying that the engine mount from XUD will fit. This mount is a bit taller, but it should be okay, and this mount is shared with Xantias and small PSA vans, so these should be available in the future. The lower engine mount was also due for replacement. Luckily, this mount is so widely used that it's unlikely to become a rare item. I wanted to use an air hammer to push out the whole mount, but I soon realized that I might do more harm than good. So I just pushed out the rubber parts instead. Now the outer sleeve can be sawn and then hammered out. The hardest part was getting the new engine mount into the bracket without using a press. Lucky for me, I have a Recon vise that is almost like a press. I'm not particularly proud of the way I drove the new mount in, but it turned out okay, and that is the most important thing. I rattle can restore the hydraulic pump. I usually paint hydraulic parts with green paint because to me a proper Citroen should always have parts that use LHM painted green. The workshop manual says to use a moly grease on friction surface, so I'm not totally sure whether that means the plastic sleeve or the tip of the torque converter, or both. In situations like this, a helping hand is always appreciated. There is really nothing special about fitting the transmission back to the engine. Just take your time to align the torque converter with the flywheel and you should be good to go. I also removed the crankshaft position sensor so I wouldn't damage it. The transmission is held in place by 4 bolts with a torque spec of 60 Newton meters. Once the transmission is fitted, you can fit the starter, high pressure line for the pump and crank sensor. And now it is time to do some really sketchy shit. I didn't realize that once the engine was ready to go back, there wouldn't be any ice left in the ground to make moving of the hoist easier. I was able to get the engine and the hoist aligned with the car by placing some 2x4s under the engine hoist and pulling the engine hoist with a chain hoist that was tied to a nearby tree. Once I was happy with alignment, I drove my trusty old BX behind the XM. This allowed me to winch the engine as close as possible. This is definitely the hardest part. There's so much to look out for, like hydraulic lines, the reservoir filter housing, aircon components, and the ABS unit. To make more room, I had to remove the engine mount from the transmission side. And here we have it, one engine successfully fitted back in the XM. Would I recommend installing the engine this way? No. Did it work? Well, yeah. Would I do it again? Only if someone pointed a gun at me. I usually grease every nut and bolt to make my life easier next time, or someone else's who is breaking this car for spares. Here are the torque specs for the engine mounts, and now I'll spare you from most of the reassemble. Getting the exhaust bolts fitted is one of the most difficult tasks on a V6 XM. You can see the exhaust flange, but you can't reach it comfortably. And what's even worse is that the exhaust bolts are spring-loaded, and it's quite tricky to get them on when you don't have any space. After a quick check, everything seems to be in order for the first start. Now take a note how the gear indicator is behaving, and if you listen really carefully, you will hear that the fuel pump is continuously making a pressure. Now take a wild guess what I have done wrong. If your answer was that two brown connectors under the LHM tank are mixed because one supplies the ECU and the other gives out the gear selector information, you can pat yourself on the back because that's correct. It's time for attempt number 2. At least some progress, but still no joy. I knew exactly what was wrong. You see, when I removed the crankshaft position sensor, I put it in a safe place, and that turned out to be so safe that I couldn't find it. So I took another sensor from my spares, and that must be broken. Luckily, my brother remembered where I had put the original sensor, so there was no need to buy a new one. The sensor itself is quite tricky to get to. It's located on the bell housing under the throttle body. My neighbor's wild predator came for a visit and gave his approval. To get better access, I recommend this kind of yoga pose. It may look a bit tricky, but I recently replaced the crank sensor on my mate's 1.2 TSI Polo, and believe me when I say this is way more accessible. They say the third time's the charm. And it draws back to life. I think this is a good way to end this video. Thanks for watching and see you next time.